My name's Dan Snow and I want to tell you about History Hit TV. It's like the Netflix for history. Hundreds of exclusive documentaries and interviews with the world's best historians. We've got an exclusive offer available to fans of Timeline. If you go to History Hit TV, you can either follow the information below this video or just Google History Hit TV and use the code TIMELINE. You get a special introductory offer. Go and check it out. In the meantime, enjoy this video.
John Nettles is one of TV's best-known detectives. Yet apart from being an actor, Nettles is also an historian, and he's long been intrigued by a little-known chapter of World War II. The British Channel Islands have been a peaceful summer resort, until in 1940 they came under the jackboot of Hitler's Wehrmacht. For 5 years, the islanders had to endure the rigours of occupation. It's a unique story of British soil under German rule, of war and of love, of Hitler's England, told by John Nettles. The Channel Islands were the working home of John Nettles for more than a decade. In the 1980s, the British actor found fame in the long-running TV series Bergerac, playing the title character of Jersey-based Detective Sergeant Jim Bergerac. When the final episode was completed in 1991, Nettles had spent 11 years on the Channel Islands. Today, to audiences the world over, he's Chief Inspector Tom Barnaby of Midsummer Murders.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name this morning.
This is D.C. Jones, by the way. My name is Barnaby, Tom Barnaby. And we'd like a little chat with you in private, please, if you may.
Before becoming an actor, Nettles had studied history at the University of Southampton. Born in 1943, the history of World War II, and in particular the fate of the Channel Islands during those years, hold a special fascination for him.
The most extraordinary experience that happened in the history of the Channel Islands was, of course, the Second World War and the occupation by the Germans. And it gave them a special status in the history of the United Kingdom. And it was an experience which was, one can only say, pretty awful.
For years, Nettles has been digging into the island's archives and collecting accounts from contemporary witnesses. He finally published the results of his efforts in a book titled Jewels and Jackboots. We follow him as he retraces his search for the scars the war has left on the islands and on its inhabitants. Before the war, Jersey was famous for its potatoes. Whereas on Guernsey, farmers were proud of their succulent tomatoes. Another typical feature of the islands were the Jersey and Guernsey cattle, both small and hardy breeds. Tourism was a more recent source of income. Affluent visitors from Britain flocked to the islands in summertime. May 1940, Hitler strikes in the west. The German army crushes France in a mere 6 weeks. By mid-June, the remnants of the British army, sent to fight alongside the French, has been driven from the continent. German units are patrolling the French Channel coastline. The aggressor is at the doorstep of the British Channel Islands. Situated off the coasts of Brittany and Normandy, the islands are separated from the mainland by just 14 miles of open water. There's Jersey, the largest island and seat of the capital, St. Helier. Then slightly smaller, Guernsey, and smaller still, Sark and Alderney. Now they're in the sights of the Führer's soldiers, eager to raise their flag on English soil. At least, that's how the Germans view it.
We're not part of the United Kingdom. We are the last possessions of the English crown, as apart from government, in Europe. And we have been autonomous since 1204. It's not something recent.
But the islanders are loyal subjects of the crown and proud of it.
They certainly, being part of the British Empire, if you like, had a propaganda value. And this value was very much appreciated by Hitler and Goebbels, of course, who saw that if they could get a foot inside the door of the British Empire, this will be one of the most tremendous propaganda coups ever.
There's no way of defending the islands by military means. Even Britain's pugnacious Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, must accept the strategic facts and orders the withdrawal of the island garrison. The British public are not informed about this move, nor are the Germans. To the islanders, the writing is on the wall. Fear spreads through the streets. Around 23,000 of the inhabitants seize the opportunity and board the last ships to England, a quarter of the island's population. 19-year-old Bob Lasser is one of those who decide to stay. He's working as an office boy for an insurance company on Jersey. Since all his colleagues have left, he's now alone to look after the office in St Helier's Hill Street. He calls the main office in Southampton and asks to be put through to the company's director.
And I was trying to tell him what was happening, and he did not believe me. And he said, "Are you trying?" And he had one of those very authoritative voices. "Are you trying to tell me that the British government is abandoning British territory without a shot being fired?" And I said, "Yes, sir, that is what is happening." "Have you been drinking?" He then demanded that I fetch the Jersey boss, whom we hadn't seen for days. I tried to tell him that already. He decided, I think, that I was not drunk, but clearly I was deranged, out of my mind, possibly dangerous, and in any case, he was far too important to listen to such rubbish, and he put down the phone.
June the 28th, 1940. 3 German bombers are approaching the Channel Islands. Their orders: to attack the harbour installations of St Helier on Jersey and those of St Peter Port on Guernsey. When they turn away, 44 islanders lie dead in the rubble, all of them civilians. Molly Behay witnessed the attack on Guernsey as a 10-year-old schoolgirl.
There was a lot of fright after that. The Guernsey people didn't know what was going to happen. They'd heard from refugees that had come from France, and the refugees were so upset that their town, they were saying Cherbourg, had been flattened completely. So there was that fright, are the Germans going to come and bomb again?
3 days later, another flight of German aircraft approaches the islands. They're Junkers 52 transport planes. On July the 1st, they touch down on the small airfields of Guernsey and Jersey.
5 planes with about 30 Germans at the airport and just landed. No firing, there was nothing there to stop them. Although I think some animals were put on the airport to try and deter them, but that didn't.
An easy victory. English-looking towns under the heel of German jackboots. It's triumphant news for the Reich's propaganda machine.
When the Germans arrived, far from being the uncivilized horde of barbarians that were expected, they turned out to be men, as one person remarked in surprised fashion, men, well, just like us, you see. And I remember a dancer telling me, she was a young dancer in Guernsey, and I said to her, what was it like when you first saw the German soldiers marching through St. Peter Port? And she said, they were so smart, so young, so handsome, and so sexy. And indeed they were. They were a victorious army. They'd swept through France in a matter of weeks.
And the Germans are already planning their next move, the invasion of Great Britain. Its codename, Operation Sea Lion. Will London, after Warsaw and Paris, be the next capital to come under Hitler's rule? Meanwhile, German newsreels are busy painting a friendly picture of life under German occupation. It's supposed to be business as usual.
So from being initially frightened and scared, out of their wits, they gradually got round to talking to them, and it was thought, well, this isn't too bad after all. Maybe we can get along, rub along quite nicely in the circumstances, and it'll be a model occupation.
John Nettles did not confine his research on everyday life under German occupation to accounts of personal memories by the locals. To get an insight into the inner workings of the occupation, he frequently visited the Jersey archive in St. Helier.
The German commanders who came over here, they were good men, and most of them were very clear and very assiduous in their attempts to help the islanders. And they stood between a lot of heat between Berlin and St. Helier and St. Peter Port, and tried to remove the sting from many of the edicts and the regulations that were handed down through Paris. The most famous of them, of course, was von Schmettau.
General Rudolf von Schmettau was appointed commander of the Channel Islands garrison in August 1940. His personal reputation, even today, is that of a gentleman. But he's just the military commander. All civil matters lie in the hands of the so-called field headquarters on Jersey, which is subordinate to the occupation authority in France. Still, its Jersey branch is given some leeway in handling matters. The German officials who work here are uniformed civil servants. The local authorities have been advised by the British government to cooperate as much as needed in the interest of the islanders. It's walking a tightrope. Resistance, however, seems no option. On orders of the field headquarters, a register is set up, holding an identity card for every single inhabitant. It's a classic example of German bureaucratic thoroughness. It's also a means of filtering out those whom Nazi ideology labels as unworthy of existence. Regulations from Berlin on this matter are unequivocal.
Basically a passport to death.
Potentially, yeah, for him.
The first restrictions against Jews are imposed in October 1940, affecting all those who couldn't get away.
Some of them were quite old men and simple men. The grocer, for example, his weekly income was 50 shillings. Small-time man. And he, of course, according to the orders against the Jews, was deprived of his means of livelihood. He wasn't allowed to go out between certain hours. He wasn't allowed to work or consort with Aryans, and he wasn't allowed to keep pets. And under the great strain of all of that, well, the effects were devastating.
There are 18 Jews officially registered as residents of the Channel Islands. Out of fear and desperation, some of them take their own lives. For most of the islanders, however, life goes on. Farming has its demanding daily routines. Encountering the visitors, as they call the Germans, soon becomes a common experience.
And the ones that used to pass in the canisters where we lived, they got to sort of recognise us, and with half a smile sometimes, or good morgen.
It's the ordinary face of occupation.
The one we heard mostly was I-E-I-O, I-ya, and they did it with such gusto. I-E-I-O, I-ya, I-E-I-O, I-ya, I-E-I-O, I-E-I-O.
Whenever they marched past, we small boys used to tail on behind, and we used to sing, of course, their famous marching song, which was highly I-lo, highly I-lo, highly I-lo, hi-lo.
The German soldiers settle down. The islands are far from the battlegrounds of the war.
We were sitting in the sun, as if on holiday. It was great, marvellous. We were being served, and we got everything we needed. Simply gorgeous.
We thought we were in paradise. Everything was so beautiful, colourful, friendly.
Freundlich.
Yes.
Yeah.
We used to say that sending us to the Channel Islands was the best thing that Herr Hitler could have done for us.
Not least because there's time and occasion for amorous adventures.
More conservative historians, anxious to maintain the good name of the islands, say that, of course, these are very rare occurrences and no such thing happened, and the chastity and the virtue of the local women was remained intact throughout the war. This is a gross lie. There was a great deal of consorting between the handsome German soldiers, of course, and the young ladies. They had a great time. And they were called jerry bags, they were called. And they indulged in what was laughingly called collaboration horizontale.
June 1941, Germany drives east. Hitler sends his armies into the Soviet Union to conquer new living space, or Lebensraum, for the German people. Great Britain is no longer considered as being the main enemy. All plans for an invasion are shelved. In the west, all along the mainland coast, the Reich goes on the defensive. The Channel Islands, which Hitler sees as his tiny bit of England, are to be kept at any price.
And he turned his face towards the east. He wanted to make sure that his bum wasn't bit in the west, and so he built a wonderful Atlantic wall. This huge defensive wall was going to stretch all the way from Denmark, the coast of Denmark, the coast of Belgium, down through France to the northern frontier of Spain. It was going to be a mighty enterprise, and at the center of this enterprise was going to be the Channel Islands. These islands, thought to be of no strategic importance by the Brits and by most of the general staff on the German side, nevertheless, Hitler was going to make them into fortresses.
It's the beginning of the Atlantic Wall, a chain of gigantic bunkers. Yet the sheer size of the project soon defeats the construction units of the army and their semi-civil counterparts in the Todt organization. Volunteers, lured by high wages, as well as conscripted civilians from all over Western Europe, are brought in. However, the workforce is nowhere near big enough.
Somebody had the bright idea that if they were going to build this huge defensive wall all the way down the west coast of Europe, then they'd need labor to do it. And the labor, they thought, could be provided by Russian soldiers, POWs.
To the Nazi regime, Soviet POWs are subhuman. At first, their captors just let them starve to death by the hundreds of thousands. But from 1942 onwards, they're herded onto the Reich's building sites as slave workers. Soon, the first transports reached the Channel Islands too.
The islanders had never seen people being treated like this. They were unloaded from the boats, stinking, in rags, and marched in full view of the civilian population. Very unpolitic thing for the German commanders to do. March through the streets of the capitals of the island, St. Helier and Peterport. And the civilians, the islanders, got their first view of true cruelty, of true inhumanity.
The Atlantic Wall is to keep the Allies from opening a second front in the West.
One-twelfth of all the material used to build that huge Atlantic wall, going all those hundreds of miles down the western coast of Europe, 1/12 of the material was used here in the Channel Islands. There was a time when the Channel Islands, particularly Alderney, were the most fortified places on Earth.
John Nettles has found proof that the Germans, protected by the Atlantic Wall, rigorously implemented their racial goals on the Channel Islands too. In this hospital on Guernsey, Therese Steiner worked and lived as an auxiliary nurse.
Therese was a vivacious, lovely girl by all accounts, full of fun and joy. She was a gifted pianist, and she used to play to the patients and the staff at Cattell Hospital. She was much loved lady.
Therese was a Jewess from Vienna. In 1942, her room is up there in the nurses' dormitory.
Therese herself came to England and was employed as a nanny by the Potts family. And she found herself in Guernsey because she came over with the Potts family, who were there to escape the war. But when it became clear that the war, in fact, was going to come to the Channel Islands, and when you could actually see and hear the guns on the Cotentin Peninsula 14 miles away from the Channel Islands, then people started to get frightened, and the Potts family decided to go back from Guernsey to London. And they, of course, wanted to take Therese with them. But war had been declared, and Therese had a Viennese, i.e. German, passport. And therefore she was classed as an enemy alien, and as such was refused permission to travel with the Potts family back to the safety, relative safety, of London.
The registry in the field headquarters lists Therese as a German. While Jews with a British passport are exempt from deportation, Therese must leave Guernsey in April 1942.
This young 26-year-old Jewish lady, who'd committed no crime apart from being Jewish, was put on a list by the Guernsey authorities. She was visited when her deportation order came through by a Guernsey policeman and taken by a Guernsey policeman down to the docks to be transported. There was a degree of collusion, collaboration, call it what you will, with the Germans there by the Guernsey authorities, which enabled this to happen.
In July 1942, she arrives here, in a vast complex of barracks called Auschwitz. Being a healthy young woman without children, she probably was selected for forced labor. We don't know for how long she survived, merely that her life, like that of so many, ended in this factory of death. On the Channel Islands, like here in St. Peter Port on Guernsey, all this seems far away. But it's not only Jews who are threatened by deportation.
notice appeared in the Guernsey paper, saying in fact by order of higher authority, all men up to the age of 70 of English birth were to be evacuated with their families to Germany, and further instructions would be given in due course. This, of course, caused great alarm on the island. The island authorities said to the Germans, why are they being evacuated? Where are they going? Are they going to be put as protective shields in German cities against bombing? Are they going to be used for work? And there were no answers, basically.
In September 1942, the Germans round up 2,000 civilians from Guernsey and Jersey. Whole families, men, women, children, are deported into the Reich. What awaits them is documented by this unique footage. It shows the internment camp of Biberach in southwestern Germany. The guards are provided by the army until they're relieved by auxiliary policemen.
And although there were Nazis amongst them, there were some very, very good guards as well, who we got on pretty well with.
All internees had been born in the United Kingdom. As such, they were classified as enemy aliens by the Germans. Hitler personally ordered the islanders' deportation as a reprisal because German civilians had been deported from Iran to Australia after the Allied invasion of Persia.
From February onwards, we were recognized as being prisoners of war, and we got a Red Cross parcel roughly every 10 days, which came from Switzerland and Portugal. So we just settled into a routine. We went to school. Initially, the boys and the girls of a certain age went in the morning, the younger ones in the afternoon. And we started getting Red Cross and other teaching aids from the YMCA and the YWCA.
The internees from the Channel Islands will have to sit out the war in Camp Biberach until their liberation in April 1945. In 1942, the outcome of the war is anything but certain. Since the fall of France, the British Army has been raising special forces whose brief is to keep the Germans on their toes by hit-and-run operations against selected targets on the continent. The Commandos, as they're called, have already undertaken several raids against the Channel Islands, albeit without tangible results. On October 3rd, 1942, they embark for Operation Basalt. A motor torpedo boat is to set them ashore on the island of Sark. A troop of 12 highly motivated commandos prepare to strike. Their mission? To bring back prisoners for interrogation. They come upon a small hotel whose annex serves as a billet for about 20 German soldiers. The sentry is killed before he can cry out a warning. The other Germans are roused from their sleep, lined up outside and tied up.
And the stories vary about what happened on that night, but it's certainly true that they were bound in some way, they were tied up in some way.
When the Germans become aware of their own superior numbers, a struggle ensues.
These were bound prisoners, shot in the back. Hitler was enraged by this and gave out the order that all Allied prisoners from henceforth should be in chains. They should be kept bound.
Yet events take an even darker turn. From now on, commandos will no longer be treated as regular soldiers. Hitler decrees that they be regarded as terrorists and saboteurs who are to be summarily executed when caught behind the German lines. It's the infamous Commando Order.
This marked an escalation in the savagery of the war. It wasn't going to be polite. It was going to be more like the Eastern Front from now on. That's what happened. And basalt was a big signpost pointing in that awful direction.
But there are also other sides to the war. On Sark, by far the smallest of the inhabited islands, German soldiers and the few islanders who have remained are living side by side.
In March 43, my unit were given orders to deploy to Sark for 6 months. I went along as my company's medical sergeant.
Young Phyllis Baker has been learning German in school, and her command of the occupants' language now proves most useful.
The German doctor was the only doctor on the island. Our doctor had left the day before the occupation.
Phyllis assists the army doctor as an interpreter, since he's also treating the civilian population of the island.
They had the surgery for the Germans, the soldiers, from 8 to 9, and the civilians from 9 to 10. So I used to go up to the hospital every morning for 9 o'clock. And then after that, I did the rounds with the doctors.
Then one day, she falls ill herself.
So my sister called the German doctor, and he came down in the morning and diagnosed the tonsillitis. And he said that he'd send the orderly down in the afternoon with the medication I needed. And so that's what happened. At 2 o'clock, the front doorbell rang. My mother went to answer the door, but she couldn't speak German, Werner couldn't speak English.
The medical orderly is Werner Rang, the doctor's new assistant.
So I went up there, I knocked at the door, and a female voice said, "Please, come in," in perfect German. She turned out to be my patient. I was very surprised. We talked. I gave her the medication and then left. I still hear her saying, "Thank you very much, goodbye," in German.
So and that was how we met. He sat on the end of the bed and chatted a little bit, and then off he went. And apparently that's when he fell in love with me, but I didn't realise that. I didn't know anything about this until 1947.
I found her most impressive. I thought, that is a very nice girl.
In September 1943, Werner's unit is redeployed to Guernsey. As on Jersey 2, the Germans turn the island into a gigantic building site.
In both islands there are tunnel complexes, massive tunnel complexes. They go for hundreds and thousands of yards underground. They are storage units for ammunition, munitions and so forth, and also used as hospitals. And some of the scale of the ambition of the Third Reich can be seen in these tunnels.
Thousands of Russian POWs must toil under the most severe conditions. The harsh treatment meted out to them horrifies the islanders.
The acts of cruelty are too numberless, really, to itemize. But they were very, very cruelly treated. And the islanders, they'd never seen people treated like this before.
One day in autumn 1942, one of the slave workers on Jersey manages to escape. His name is Fyodor Bury. The Germans are determined to track him down. A farmer affords him provisional shelter. An act of resistance out of mere decency. It's not the only one on the islands. Louisa Gould doesn't live far from the farm. She runs the village shop in this house.
2 weeks later, a farmer neighbour asked her if she could take a young man for a week or two. He was an escapee from a camp, while this farmer found a safer place further away. And her words to me were, and I don't think this farmer knew that she'd lost her elder son, but her words to me were, I had to do something for another mother's son. And she took him in, and she bathed his wounds, and she fed him, and she mothered him, and he was the same age as the dead son.
Her son Edward, a lieutenant in the Royal Navy, had been killed in 1941 when his ship was torpedoed in the Mediterranean. Now Fyodor is wearing his clothes. Louisa simply calls him Bill. An English-Russian dictionary helps them to communicate after a fashion. Yet Louisa is denounced by a resentful neighbour. Bill manages to slip away just in time. Louisa, however, is arrested, and there is evidence that incriminates her.
And she was tried, and instead of being given what was expected, a jail sentence, she was transported to France, and from France to Ravensbrück. Incredible. And there she was, we don't know, but it is thought that she was worked to death. And then when she became too ill to work, she either died or she was gassed, and then, in either case, was put into the ovens. That's what happened to Louisa Gould, who, for an act of sheer humanity and for another man, well, another mother's son, as she said, suffered that terrible, terrible fate.
This for Louisa Gould, a fine Jersey lady.
The man whom she's been protecting for more than 20 months finds another hideout.
After work, I took him, and he on the bicycle, following me at some distance to my office, of which I was in charge, and he spent that weekend in the filing room.
But Fyodor cannot stay in the office when there's public business. Friends of Bob Lasser share the risk of hiding him until the war finally ends. Fyodor, alias Bill, survives, unlike many of his comrades. There's documentation on the death of at least 400 slave workers and POWs. There may have been even more. June the 6th, 1944. Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy. It's D-Day at last. The Second Front in the West, Hitler's strategical nightmare, is now a reality. The fortifications on the Channel Islands are being readied for all-round defense. But no attacker appears on the horizon. The Allied planners have decided to leave the islands alone. The division-strong German garrison can merely sit things out and tighten their belts.
after D-Day, everything changed because all the supply ports for the islands on the Cotentin Peninsula, the Cherbourg Peninsula, were occupied by the Allies, and they quickly moved inland, and the front moved away from the Channel Islands. And there were no supplies coming through, therefore, to the Channel Islands. And almost immediately there were shortages of medicine, food, and fuel.
When autumn approaches, there's hardly any food left in the shops.
We were all trying to eat on what 116 square kilometers, not all of which are fertile, could produce. So it soon became real privation, and in other ways too. I mean, there was no heating of any kind, unless you could get hold of wood, but that was illegal. We were cold, we were hungry, our clothing was threadbare.
For the German soldiers too, the good life is a thing of the past. Shortages are the order of the day. The army's horses provide them with meat for a while. The locals must resort to different means.
Cats and dogs were eaten by the locals come the end. So people lost their pets.
Only the cows are spared the butcher's knife. Germans and islanders have agreed to keep them, so at least the children will have milk.
The islanders themselves appealed to Churchill because they were starving, they wanted food. They said, please allow a Red Cross ship or something to bring us help, to bring us aid, to bring us food and medicines and so on, because we are dying, simple as that. There was a famous minute at the side of a paper at the meeting of the War Cabinet when this proposition was put to Churchill that he should indeed send a boat full of goodies to the Channel Islands. And the note at the side says, let them starve. Charitable commentators say that this merely referred to the German soldiers.
In late December 1944, after months of negotiations, the SS Vega, a Swedish Red Cross ship, delivers badly needed supplies. Her cargo is for the civilian population. The Germans come away empty-handed.
They never took a parcel, to their credit, because they were literally starving.
There's not even fish to augment the meagre diet. The mistrustful Germans won't allow the island's cutters to put out to sea, since once out of sight, the fishermen could make contact with the enemy. The German soldiers resort to the most primitive measures in their search for food.
Our company had 3 platoons. One was sent to collect the edible leaves of stinging nettles. The second one was ordered to the cliffs, where they were to scrape off mussels. So only 1/3 of our unit was on actual duty. The mussels were made into meatballs, with sand grinding between your teeth.
In the end, we shot seagulls, which we plucked like chickens and then cooked and ate.
This is London calling. Here is a news flash. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead. I repeat that. The German radio has just announced that Hitler is dead.
May the 9th, 1945. The German garrison has held out right to the end, isolated and half-starved. Now they surrender.
we thought, well, this got to be it. Mum, Dad, come on, we're going down to the harbour.
5 years after their withdrawal, the British Army returns to Guernsey. It's an emotional moment for everyone.
And we just loved these soldiers. Their hats were tipped off, their rifles were down, everything was disarrayed with them, but they were crying with us. They were actually so overcome.
Bob Lasser recalls one particular day shortly after the liberation on Jersey.
2 Spitfires came over the fort, zoom, with a lot of noise. And I glanced up and, oh, the markings, they're ours, it's all right. There was still that first reaction. And they went over the bay and they came back. Zoom! And I burst into tears. And I was 24. Big boys don't cry. And it wasn't just tears. I was sobbing like this. And I drew myself together within a minute, probably, terribly ashamed. And then I could see a man who was perhaps in his 40s, standing nearby, and he was doing the same. I didn't understand at that time that this was therapeutic, that I was releasing.
The Channel Islands had lived through 5 years of German occupation, the only part of the British Empire ever subjected to Hitler's rule.
It is certainly true that the British did not understand the nature of the experience that the Channel Islanders had gone through. They didn't understand what had gone on because they didn't understand what it was like to be in the same room with a savage dog. It didn't occur to these people, it seems to me, that it is far better to try and pacify the savage dog than to have the savage dog bite your bum.
The need to come to terms with the enemy is over. Almost 25,000 German soldiers lay down their arms. How do they look back on their years on the islands?
Ich habe zum Teil eine Inselzeit mitgemacht.
In part, it was a time when you lived as if on holiday.
Vielleicht sonst im Urlaub erlebt hätte. Ich habe zum anderen Teil eine Hungerzeit mitgemacht.
On the other hand, there were the months of hunger,
schön war,
which were just terrible.
Die grausam war. Aber alles in allem kann ich sagen,
but all in all, for a German soldier to have been stationed on an island that didn't come under attack, where there was no combat,
wo es keine Kampfhandlungen und keine Angriffe gab,
I still consider it a blessing from God.
Besonderer Segen Gottes.
The former occupants, now POWs, are shipped to England. And again, destiny smiles on them. Post-war captivity is a comparatively mild affair. After some time, there are even permits allowing a day outside the camps.
1946. I think it was in 1946 that German prisoners could be invited by English families for a day.
Werner Rang is granted a special perk. A high-born English lady invites 2 German POWs into her house for Christmas.
And they were the lucky ones to be selected. So off they went. And then she took them under her wing, and she used to have them there some afternoons and make sure they had a nice tea and gave them 5 shillings each. They used to do jobs in the garden or polish the car or something for her.
The hostess, Lady Vera, even takes care of her protégés when it comes to matters of the heart.
I told her about Phyllis. She asked, would you like to have her come over for a holiday? That would be nice, wouldn't it? And since I wasn't allowed any phone calls, she said, leave that to me. I'll invite her.
And then the next thing was I had a letter from her inviting me to go for holiday. And so I went. I had a 3 weeks holiday due in the end of the October, November. And so I went there, and that was where the acquaintance was renewed, and we had a lovely time.
In 1948, thousands of German POWs are released and shipped back home. Werner is still in Britain. 6 months after their reunion, and 160 letters later, he and Phyllis meet again.
And then he said that he wasn't going home because his home was in the Eastern Zone. And would I marry him, you see? And I said yes, but I said, but hadn't you better go home first? Because he was an only child. It was awful for his parents. But he said nothing would induce him to go into the Russian zone.
There's only one solution, an express wedding.
We were married on the 13th of May, on the Thursday, and he would have been deported the next morning at 9 o'clock. That was how short that was.
For almost 70 years now, the erstwhile member of the occupying forces lives on the Isle of Sark, side by side with his wife. John Nettles, too, spent many years on these islands. To him, their unique history as Hitler's England still holds particular significance.
The people who had been through the occupation, I think they too were changed, because one thing I think that conflict does, war does, it forces people to face up to what they really are. And Bob Le Sueur is most wise on this, and he will tell you, as I will tell you too, that those people who are good tend to become better, and those people who are bad tend to become worse. You find out who you are, and the islanders certainly found out who they were.